Why Fools Rule the World. Scientific explanation. Have you ever sat in a meeting, in a classroom, in a parliament, in any of the countless institutions through which modern societies organize themselves and make their most consequential decisions, and felt a quiet, disturbing certainty that the person with the most authority in the room was not the most intelligent person in it? Have you ever watched someone rise to a position of enormous power and influence and thought, with a clarity that you immediately suppressed because it seemed too dangerous or too cynical to fully acknowledge, that this person's ascent had very little to do with their wisdom, their judgment, their actual understanding of the systems they were now controlling? Have you ever looked at the people who run our governments, our corporations, our cultural institutions, our financial systems, and asked yourself with genuine bewilderment how this happened? How did we arrive at a world where the decisions that determine the fate of billions of people are so often made by people who seem so profoundly unqualified to make them? This feeling is not elitism. It is not the sour resentment of people who believe they deserved power and did not receive it. It is something more precise and more disturbing than that. It is the specific discomfort of a pattern that, once you see it clearly, appears almost everywhere you look. The pattern of competence being consistently undervalued, of wisdom being systematically pushed to the margins, of a specific set of qualities that have almost nothing to do with actual intelligence or judgment or understanding, reliably producing social dominance across cultures, across historical periods, across virtually every kind of institution that human beings have ever created. This is not a paranoid fantasy. It is not the political complaint of one faction against another. It is, as we are about to discover, one of the most well-documented and scientifically grounded phenomena in the entire field of human psychology and social organization. And understanding why it happens, understanding the precise mechanisms through which fools so reliably end up ruling the world, is not merely an academic exercise. It is, at this specific moment in human history, when the decisions being made by the people at the top of our institutions will determine whether civilization navigates its current crises or collapses under the weight, one of the most urgent intellectual tasks that any serious human being can undertake. So let us begin where the science actually begins. Let us begin with a question that sounds almost too simple, but turns out to be extraordinarily deep. What actually determines who rises to the top of human social hierarchies? What qualities, what behaviors, what characteristics reliably produce social dominance in the specific kinds of institutions that modern societies have created? Because the answer to this question, the answer that emerges not from political theory or moral philosophy, but from decades of careful empirical research into how human beings actually behave in actual social contexts, is one of the most unsettling findings in all of social science. The qualities that most reliably produce social dominance in human institutions are not the qualities that most reliably produce good decisions, accurate assessments of reality, genuine understanding of complex systems, or wise judgment in conditions of uncertainty. They are, with disturbing consistency, a different set of qualities entirely. Confidence, dominance displays, the specific social performances through which individuals signal that they belong at the top of the hierarchy. The capacity to speak with certainty when certainty is not warranted. The willingness to project authority in situations where genuine authority would require acknowledging complexity and uncertainty. The ability to make other people feel in the immediate social moment that they are in the presence of someone who knows what they are doing, regardless of whether that impression bears any relationship to actual competence. Let us be precise about what the research actually shows, because the findings are remarkable. In study after study, across wildly different contexts and cultures, researchers have found that the correlation between actual competence and social status in human groups is far weaker than almost everyone intuitively believes. What actually predicts who emerges as a leader, who gets promoted, who accumulates influence and authority, is far more reliably predicted by a cluster of traits that psychologists have studied under various names, but that all circle around the same core: the confident performance of competence rather than competence itself. The social skills required to make others feel secure and led, rather than the intellectual skills required to actually navigate the situation competently. The ability to dominate social dynamics, rather than the ability to understand and manage the underlying realities those dynamics are supposed to address. This finding has been replicated so many times in so many different contexts that it has achieved the status of one of the most robust findings in social psychology. And yet, it remains almost entirely absent from public discourse about leadership, about governance, about the organization of institutions. We continue to speak as though the people who rise to the top of our institutions generally deserve to be there, as though the process by which they rose reflects some reliable connection between the qualities required for dominance and the qualities required for good decisions. The research says with remarkable consistency that this assumption is wrong. Not occasionally wrong, systematically, structurally, mechanically wrong, in a way that is built into the very architecture of how human social hierarchies function. To understand why this is, you need to understand something about the evolutionary history of human social organization that is rarely discussed in polite company, but is absolutely essential for understanding the world we currently inhabit. Human beings are a social species. We have been a social species for so long, and our survival has depended so completely on our ability to function within groups that natural selection has shaped our psychology in profound and pervasive ways to orient our behavior toward the social dynamics of the group rather than toward the independent assessment of reality. For most of human evolutionary history, the individual who survived and reproduced successfully was not necessarily the individual who understood reality most accurately. It was the individual who navigated the social dynamics of their group most effectively, who managed their status and their alliances and their reputation with sufficient skill to remain embedded in the group rather than being expelled from it. This means that the human brain, the same brain that is capable of producing the mathematics of general relativity and the music of Bach and the moral philosophy of Kant, is also, at a much deeper and more automatic level, a status tracking machine. It is constantly, unconsciously assessing the social hierarchy of every group it finds itself in, monitoring signals of dominance and submission, adjusting behavior to maintain or improve status, and making rapid, largely unreflective judgments about who deserves deference and who deserves contempt based on cues that were reliable predictors of genuine capability in the small face-to-face groups of our evolutionary past, but that are largely decoupled from genuine capability in the complex institutions of the modern world. The cues that triggered status recognition in our evolutionary past were, for the most part, genuinely correlated with the qualities that mattered for group survival in that environment. A person who displayed physical strength and confident body language in a small hunter-gatherer band probably was more capable of protecting the group from external threats than a person who displayed weakness and uncertainty. A person who spoke with confidence and decisiveness in a small tribal council probably did have more experience and better judgment than a person who hesitated and qualified. In the environment for which our social psychology was designed, the signals of status and the reality of competence were reasonably well correlated. Not perfectly, not always, but well enough that following those signals was a reasonable heuristic for identifying genuine leadership. But the institutions of the modern world are not small hunter-gatherer bands or tribal councils. They are extraordinarily complex systems, governing processes and managing information at scales that would be literally incomprehensible to our evolutionary ancestors. The qualities required for genuinely effective leadership in a modern government, a modern corporation, a modern research institution, a modern international organization are almost entirely cognitive rather than physical or performative. They require the ability to reason accurately about systems of enormous complexity, to integrate information from vast and varied sources, to maintain calibrated uncertainty rather than false confidence in situations where the honest answer is genuinely unclear, to update beliefs rapidly when new evidence demands it, and to make decisions whose consequences will unfold over years or decades rather than hours or days. None of these qualities are well signaled by the social cues that our status recognition psychology was designed to respond to. In fact, several of them are actively anti-correlated with the behaviors that reliably produce social dominance in human groups. The person who maintains calibrated uncertainty, who says, "I am not sure, and here is what I do not know," alongside "here is what the evidence suggests," is performing a social behavior that our status recognition system reads as weakness. The person who updates their beliefs rapidly when new evidence demands it is performing a behavior that in social terms looks like inconsistency, like someone who does not really know what they think. The person who acknowledges the genuine complexity of a situation, who resists the temptation to compress it into a simple narrative that can be communicated with confidence and conviction, is performing a behavior that, in the social dynamics of most human institutions, reliably produces less status than the person who compresses everything into a simple narrative and communicates it with absolute conviction, regardless of whether that narrative bears any reliable relationship to the actual complexity it is supposed to represent. What this means in practical terms is that human social institutions have a systematic structural bias toward selecting for a specific cluster of psychological traits that are genuinely useful for navigating social hierarchies and genuinely harmful for making good decisions. And because this bias is not a conscious policy choice, but a built-in feature of how human social psychology functions, it is almost impossible to eliminate through the usual mechanisms of institutional design. You can create rules and procedures and selection processes intended to identify and promote genuine competence. But those rules and procedures and selection processes will themselves be administered and interpreted by human beings whose status recognition psychology is operating at a level below conscious awareness systematically distorting their assessments in the direction of social performance rather than actual capability. This is the first and most fundamental mechanism through which fools end up ruling the world. Not through conspiracy, not through the deliberate suppression of competent rivals by malicious actors, but through the automatic, unconscious operation of a social psychology that evolved to solve a problem in a very different environment, and that is now in the enormously complex institutions of the modern world systematically selecting for the wrong qualities. But there is a second mechanism, equally well documented and equally disturbing, that compounds and accelerates the first. It is a phenomenon that researchers have studied under a number of names, but that is perhaps most precisely described as the Dunning-Kruger effect in its full, complex, and frequently misunderstood form. The core finding, which has been replicated dozens of times across cultures and contexts, is that the people who are least competent in a given domain tend to be precisely the people who are most confident in their competence in that domain. And the reason for this is not simply that incompetent people are unaware of their own limitations. It is something more precise and more deeply embedded in the psychology of human cognition. To accurately assess your own competence in a domain, you need the very metacognitive skills that competence in that domain requires. A person who lacks the knowledge and thinking skills required to reason well about a complex subject also necessarily lacks the ability to recognize when the reasoning about that subject is inadequate. They are missing not just the competence, but the cognitive tools that would allow them to perceive their incompetence. The less you know, the less equipped you are to know what you do not know.